So we're in 1 Samuel 13. 1 Samuel 13. And last time we were talking about Saul's great moment of triumph as king. It was their first real military test with him as king. And after such an awesome victory, the people enthusiastically redeclared him as king. He'd already been proclaimed as king once, but now they're like, okay, now we really mean it. Now we're enthusiastically calling him king. And everything was going so great for Saul, but unfortunately, it wasn't going to last. And so today in our study, we're going to be looking at the choices of the faithless versus the choices of the faithful and the outcomes of those two different decisions. I think you'll see that as we go forward. And so let's start with 1 Samuel 13, verse 1. It says, Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. Now Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. But he sent away the rest of the people, each to his tent. Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. All Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. The people were then summoned to Saul at Gilgal. And so in these verses, we get introduced to another character in 1 Samuel, and that is Jonathan. And you might remember from our introduction to 1 Samuel, I said there were basically three main characters we're going to look at in 1 Samuel, and that was Samuel himself, and then also Saul and David. But Jonathan is also a key part of the supporting cast. He's also a big player in 1 Samuel. And we notice that Jonathan is a grown man here. I mean, he's serving as a military leader along with his father. And so clearly some time has passed since Saul was declared king. Back in chapter 9, verse 2, when it talks about Saul being a handsome man there, or yours may say winsome man. There's different ways it's translated. Well, the word translated as man there in your English Bibles, in Hebrew is really young man. And so we understand from that he couldn't have been more than like 30 years old. Now, being someone who's over 30 myself, I disagree a little bit with that. I think I'm still a young man, but technically, in Hebrew, it would be up to like 30. He'd be a young man. And just how old Saul was is a little bit in question, though, as you may have noticed in your Bible, because in chapter 13, verse 1 there, where it says Saul was 30 years old when he began his reign, well, probably in your Bible, the word 30 there is in italics or something like that, to note that this isn't in the original manuscripts we have today, or the manuscripts that we have today. The originals we no longer have, but the copies that we have don't have that age anymore. And so the age of 30 is somewhat of an educated guess by translators that, well, probably around 30 based on what we saw in chapter 9. Also in that same verse, when it says he reigned 42 years over Israel, the word 40 there is also probably italicized, because that too is not in the manuscripts that we have today. And so, it's again somewhat of an educated guess, although this one we have a little more to work with, because from Acts chapter 13, in verse 21, Paul talks about the reign of Saul, and he rounds it to 40. So that's why we assume, well, it says here 2 years, probably means 42 years, and Paul just kind of rounded it to 40 years when he addressed it, or when we talked about it. As we often do, we round things off, One of the things that my family and I like to joke about is we round off our heights, and none of us round down. We usually round up. No way. Of course, we're going to round up, right? So anyways, some extra biblical sources. Josephus tells us that Saul reigned for 18 years before Samuel died. And so there again, we see, a number of years, obviously more than 2 years that Saul reigned. Even that, and obviously Saul's reign went on after Samuel died as well. And so at this point today, as we're reading in 1 Samuel 13, Samuel is still alive. This is within those first 18 years. And so for Jonathan to even be like 20 years old, commentators speculate that Saul was probably around 40 at this point. So he'd probably been reigning for 10 years now as king. So between chapter 12 and chapter 13, there's a gap of 10 years there as it goes forward to the next significant thing in Saul's reign. And Jonathan, back to Jonathan, we want to learn a little more about Jonathan. His name means the Lord has given. And if you've studied 1 Samuel ever before in your life, you agree that the Lord had given Jonathan. Jonathan is an awesome guy. We're going to learn more about him in the coming weeks. Certainly the Lord gave him as a gift to Saul. This son of his is just awesome. Jonathan actually shows himself to really outdo his father in many regards. He's certainly more godly than his father. He certainly shows himself to be more wise, probably more brave and more kingly. I mean, he just kind of like, wow, chip off the old block. Well, a lot better than the old block in this case. He turns out to be much better than Saul was. So must have had a really good mother, that raised him well. And he is such an awesome asset to his father. I mean, he's very loyal to his father, even though his father is, again, not that great a king. Later, though, in 1 Samuel, we're going to find that Jonathan is a real gift of God to David as well. David and Jonathan are the closest of friends. I mean, they're like, BFF, I guess is the term today, I mean, they're super tight, great buds. And Jonathan even works to save David's life at one point. And in that point, I talked about him being loyal to his father. That was a real trial for Jonathan because he had to pick God's will over his father's will at that point. Because Saul, you remember, wanted to kill David. And so Jonathan's like, hey, this is God's anointed. This can't happen. And Jonathan then also is a gift to us today to learn about this man. It is really awesome just to study about him as we're going to over the next several weeks as we learn more things about him. But let's talk a little bit about Israel's army because that's also something that's referenced in these verses we read. First of all, you see that it said down around verse 2 or 3, I think it was, that Saul had sent everyone back to his tent. And so that was like the general population. It's just making it clear contextually from chapter 12 where basically they had called out everybody. Well, at this point, everyone's been sent back. People weren't on duty for 10 years, away from their families and their livestock and all that. They were back home taking care of business. But Saul kept about 2,000 soldiers with him. And another 1,000 were with Jonathan. So they have an army of 3,000 soldiers right now. And Saul has moved to Michmash, where Jonathan has stayed in Gibeah, which remember is Saul's hometown. And so that also then is Jonathan's hometown. And the choice of these two cities, which it's difficult because these cities don't really exist anymore, but they appear to be strategically to prevent Philistine invasion. They're kind of apart from each other, sort of trying to form like a vague boundary there. It's hard to make out exact borders with how this whole conflict was going on with the Philistines because, for one thing, a lot of these places don't exist anymore. Another thing is the Bible doesn't really draw that out and say, hey, the front line was here. And, it doesn't really talk in those, military tactical ways that, as, Americans we like to hear. But it looks more like the Philistines would actually come in and kind of take a specific city, because remember at that time, that was sort of your battle plan is you had these walled cities. And whenever someone came to attack, you all get inside there and lock up the wall, lock up the gates so no one can get in. And it seems like they're kind of trying to knock off cities. It seems like really kind of their tactic. And so one such city that the Philistines had taken over was Geba. And Geba was directly between Michmash and Gibeah. So we got Saul and Michmash, we got Jonathan and Gibeah, and then in the middle of those is Geba. And so Jonathan takes Geba back for Israel. And, it's clear, from as we read all those verses, that Saul was in favor of this because the word went out that Saul had smitten the Philistines, even though it was actually Jonathan who had done it, So, it's just kind of showing that Jonathan wasn't, going rogue here and saying, I got this 1,000-member army, I'm just going to do what I want to. No, he was actually following what his father wanted him to do there. But as a result of them taking back this city, it angered the Philistines. And so Saul now is rallying all the troops again because he's expecting a response from the Philistines. And so let's read a little more here. And as we read some more, we're going to get into our first major point in our outline today, and that is really the folly of the faithless. Let's read from 1 Samuel 13:5. It says, Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. And they came up and camped in Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were hard pressed, then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets, in cliffs, in cellars, and in pits. Also, some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So Saul basically gives up Michmash. That's where he had 2,000 soldiers. Well, now we see the Philistines are in Michmash. So they have taken over Michmash. And Saul has moved all of his men over to Gilgal, which is actually, further east of Geba. And, this was not necessarily a faithless act on his part. This was probably a wise act on his part. I mean, he's got 2,000 soldiers. They had 6,000 horsemen alone. And it says their soldiers were like the sand of the seashore. So this is this huge army. It's like, this isn't going to work out too well. Let's get out of here, and let's kind of rally our troops so we've got some sort of force to meet these guys with. But we see that the people who gathered here, they're the first group of the faithless ones that we see here in our text today. Because we see that, we read from those verses that they see this large army of Philistines and they start hiding, they start scattering, they start running away. All these soldiers, all these people that have been assembled on Israel's side. And when we look at verse 15, further down in our verses today, you'll see that by the time they're ready for military action, Saul only has 600 men now. Oh, wait a minute. At the beginning, he had 2,000 and Jonathan had 1,000. That's 3,000. Now they're down to 600. So even their soldiers, the full-time soldiers, skedaddled. They're like, whoa, this looks bad. We're out of here, is what happened. And so it just, it looks like a bad situation, obviously, coming up. And the Israelites, it says there they felt like they were in a strait. They felt basically like they were sitting ducks is what's happening. And when it says a strait there, we think of like geographically, we think of like a strait. That's a nautical term anyways. And so we think of like a narrow space in terms of that, but that's not really what it's trying to convey. The Hebrew word does mean to be troubled or cramped or tied up, but it's not. When you look at the geography of where they were, I don't think they really had a strait that they were in, like a narrow space that they were in. But it means more that they just felt that emotionally, like, oh my goodness, look at this. Their army's as large as the sand of the seashore. This is terrible. Let's get out of here. And so they ran and they hid. And those that ran away, it says they went over to like where Gad is. Well, they went actually east of the Jordan River. So they're already pretty far east. These guys went as far east as you can and still be in Israel. That's where they went. They went as far away as they could from the action. Now, last time we were together and we studied chapter 12, we talked about this great victory that happened under Saul's leadership, this great victory that Israel had. And that had been a while ago, maybe 10 years ago. But clearly that was in the lifetime of these men. Some of them would have been soldiers then, and they couldn't all be like young people then. They couldn't all have been 10 years old then. Some of them would have been in their 20s or whatever. And so they would have been around when that happened. So why did they have no faith today? Why are they why are they freaking out at this? There were those that hid, there were those that ran, but even those who stayed with Saul, it says in verse 7 there that they were trembling. I mean, they were afraid too. All of them are just totally freaking out. Now, this last group, we can say at least they stayed. At least they didn't run. They weren't hiding in holes in the ground and all this. And I note from that, too, that, even when we're walking in faith, which these guys are, I would say, that they stayed there, our knees sometimes wobble a little bit, and that's okay, that we can be walking in faith and not totally bold and courageous and just going to jump off the cliff. I mean, there can be a little bit of nervousness in that and still be walking in God's will. Just I'll throw that in there for no extra charge. And, it's sad, though, to see this, isn't it? That just like these people, we're so forgetful, aren't we? I mean, we're so forgetful of the things that God does in our lives. I mean, and God often tests us. I'm sure you've experienced, if you've been a Christian more than, like a month, that He tests us in the same way. Over and over again, He'll test us in the same area. And perhaps that's because, we tend to have those areas that we struggle the most in. Maybe that's why. But we'll be faced with the same circumstances, and they're circumstances where previously we've seen God do something awesome, where God totally delivered us. And the question is out there in our minds, or presented to us, are we going to believe this time? Are we going to believe that God has got this? Will that past experience, is that going to build up our faith? That's what God intends for it to do, to build up our faith. Well, as we saw, the Israelites mostly fail here, don't they? I mean, they dwindle down to, like I said in verse 15, only 600 people, and they too are scared. But let's not make the mistake that they made. Let's not make the mistake of these ancient Israelites. Let's look on those past times that God's been faithful in our lives, where He has provided. Let's look at those past experiences as building blocks. And let's sort of stand on top of those building blocks in our lives, those moments where God really came through. Let them build up our faith. And in order for us to do that, it's important that we remember those things that God has done in the past. And, there's ways we can help ourselves remember. We talked about this on previous studies before, that we can write it down, or in some way record something that God did. Maybe write it in the leaflet of your Bible or something like that. Somewhere where you can look back and go, God really delivered on this day and time. Here's briefly the thing that was worrying me, and look what God did, how God took care of all those circumstances. Another way is we can just tell others about it. When God works in your life, it doesn't have to be this deep, dark, secret thing that you write in a closet somewhere. You can tell people, you can share that with your brothers and sisters in the Lord, because they will be encouraged too to hear how God's working in your life. I know it always blesses me to hear these things. But we're talking about faithlessness here, and the faithlessness that we see in this chapter doesn't stop with the people, unfortunately. It goes right to the top. Let's read from 1 Samuel 13, verse 8. Now he, that is Saul, waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which He commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for Himself a man after His own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over His people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And so now we see Saul's big lack of faith here, and his resulting big mistake he makes in these verses. Samuel had apparently previously communicated God's direction to Saul, that you're to wait, I will come in 7 days and I will give the offering before any sort of military campaign takes place. Saul doesn't do that. Saul disobeys and goes ahead and does the offering himself. Now it's interesting that God had him wait 7 days, because 7 is symbolic of completion in the Bible. Now we don't know what needed to be completed, if that's the intent here. We don't know why 7 days was necessary, but it was God's plan. And so, Saul's responsibility was to follow God's plan. And no doubt one reason God said 7 days like this was to test Saul's faith. Is he going to trust in me that I got this covered? And Saul fails miserably, unfortunately. I mean, it was a scary situation, and he completely blows it, doesn't he? But it was such an opportunity for him to trust God. And we understand Saul's dilemma. I mean, no one likes to wait, right? But he knew exactly how long he had to wait. All he had to do was wait those 7 days. I mean, don't we love that? We struggle with, how long am I going to wait? I have no idea, until something happens, But at least he knew exactly how long. But God makes us wait, so we learn to trust Him too. That's why He wants us to wait. And because in those times, we have to trust in Him, and we build that trust in Him. After 7 days, Samuel was going to come and make the offering. But, waiting on Samuel like this ought to have seemed familiar to Saul. I mean, he's done a lot of that already in this book. I mean, in fact, his very first meeting with Samuel, that's how it went too. In 1 Samuel 9, verse 13. When he was going to meet the prophet, the people said, well, the prophet will come, he'll give the blessing, and then that's when everything continues from there. It's like his first meeting with Samuel was one of waiting on Samuel. So this is sort of like a pattern God's established. You wait, let the prophet do what the prophet does, and then you continue. But Saul gets impatient, he offers the sacrifice. And in verse 8, the text tells us the real reason that he offered the sacrifice, and that is that the people were leaving. The soldiers were continuing to leave, defect, go hide, run away, whatever they were doing. And remember that we already talked about tons have already gone into hiding at this point. And so watching more go away, he's just like, he's freaking out here. And, as they just wait around, they keep thinning out. And you can kind of imagine what was going through their minds. I mean, there's like, okay, there's this huge army over there that no one can even count how many there are there. And then there's like, how many of us here? I think I can count like 700 at this point. We're going to get down to 600 eventually, I mean, you can understand the math they're doing in a fleshly manner. They're just thinking, why am I waiting around here to get killed by the Philistines with this, pitiful army that we've got against this impressive, awe-inspiring army they have? They have more chariots and more horsemen than we have people. What are we waiting for? And so Saul does something here that a spiritual leader never should do, and that is that he tries to please the crowd, is what he does in this offering. Not that a spiritual leader should purposely seek to anger people or cause trouble for people, but a spiritual leader's duty is to follow God. And then to trust that as they're following God and others are following God, we're all going to see the same picture. We're going to get to the same place. But when a leader focuses on pleasing others apart from God's will, then there's no end to it. There's no way to get off of that conveyor belt. As it says in Proverbs 29, verse 25, the fear of man is a snare. And that's exactly what Saul has fallen into here. That was from Proverbs 29, verse 25. And we've seen previously that Saul has this kind of people-pleaser side to him that he struggles with. And so he was likely thinking that, I'm losing these guys, and they're just sitting around talking amongst themselves, and they're freaking out and they're leaving. So we need some activity here. We need to show progress. So let's do the sacrifice. We'll do the sacrifice. That'll satisfy them. That'll cool their jets. We do the sacrifice. So it must be coming up soon. We're going to do something, right? God's going to get involved here because we just did a sacrifice. I mean, that's what he's kind of hoping it looks like. But, just like a well-scripted, comedy here, as Saul offers a sacrifice, boom, there's Samuel right there. Just as he gets done doing it, Not while he's preparing to, right after he's done. And it's obvious what happened, but Samuel, gives Saul a chance to explain himself. It's sort of like a parent with their children. So what happened here? Even though you know exactly what happened, he gives Saul a chance to come clean. But you notice from verse 11 that Saul really doesn't want to come clean here. Saul is just basically blame shifting. He puts the blame on everyone else that he can think of in this environment. First of all, it's not his fault, it's the people's fault. Because the people were scattering. So it's really their fault. I had to do this to get them to hold steady. And then next, it's your fault, Samuel. You were late. If you'd have been here, I would have never done this. So it's your fault, Samuel, that I didn't trust God here. And then also the Philistines. Well, the Philistines, they're in Michmash, this huge army, so I had to do it. What if I hadn't offered the sacrifice and they came, before I was ready? And in verse 12, conversely, that Saul paints himself as the hero. He says, I needed to ask God's favor through this sacrifice. So he had a spiritual reason, that he disobeyed God and offered this sacrifice. And then he says, I had to force myself to make this offering. I love that. Everything inside me said no. It was this moral struggle, But I had to do it. I was the moral hero here and offered the sacrifice. This all sounds like rationalizations of the flesh, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit familiar to us, I think. It sounds like the ways we try and talk ourselves into sinning or justify sinning in some way or compromising. All the while in our mind thinking, well, what else could I do? I could obey God. That's what I could do. That's always the better choice, is to listen to God. But despite all of Saul's rationalizations here, God is not fooled and Samuel is not fooled in all of this. They know exactly what really happened here. Saul disobeyed God. That's the net of it, isn't it? He disobeyed God. All of his reasonings mean nothing beyond that. And it's the same for us too. In the end, if we compromise, if we, sin and we disobey God, no matter what window dressing we try and hang on it, that in the end, that's what it is. That's what really happened. And so what do we do then? Well, we need to confess that sin to God. And we know that God will forgive us as believers because Jesus died on the cross to take away our sins. And so it's not like, I compromised one time and it's all over. I'm just, like what happens to Saul here. That's not what's going to happen to us today. We know that we're under God's grace. And so he will forgive. But we do need to confess that sin to him. We need to come clean with God about it and not try and hide it. And that's my next point here is, we don't want to allow ourselves to get caught up in trying to rationalize our sin. We all have that desire to try and make it look like what we did was the right thing, but sometimes we know we did the wrong thing and we can get wrapped up in trying to make it look right. Well, we can't make it look right if it's wrong. There's just no way to do that. And I've seen believers in my life, as a believer myself, I've seen other believers fall in this way where they don't want to come clean about some sin in their life. And so rather than confessing it to the Lord and being healed by the Lord, like it says in 1 John 1:9, they carry that sin around with them like a chain around their neck, And it may be one of those situations where everybody else knows. It's real obvious to everyone else what needs to happen. But that person just can't let go of it. They can't admit that they blew it, And so that sin just keeps coming up in their life. It comes up all the time, how they're trying to rationalize and defend what they did. They're talking about it with people that don't even know anything about it. Weren't even around when it happened. They have no clue. And this person's bringing it up and trying to build up a case for themselves with this person who's like, what are you talking about? I don't even know. I wasn't even there. It's that sin that they can't admit. It ends up marring the rest of their Christian life. And we don't want to be in that camp. We want to be free from sin. We don't want to be chained to sin. And so, the path to freedom from sin is not in reasoning about it, not in trying to rationalize it, not trying to explain it away. It's simply in confessing it to God and being honest with God. And sometimes we need to confess to other people too. If we harmed other people, we need to be willing to, make that effort to bring that reconciliation and all of that and just come clean about it. And then, all of us know this. All of us who are believers, we've confessed sin in our lives. And it feels so good to be free, doesn't it? It feels so good to just that weight off your shoulders and not carry that thing around anymore. Because God doesn't want you carrying that thing around. He doesn't want me carrying something like that around either. We just need to confess and let go of it. We don't always need to confess to other people. Sometimes we do. But we always need to confess to the Lord. But Saul's life here is going to be changed by this sin in a negative way, because he is just trying to, make it look right when it was wrong. He's not coming clean. And so not only is it going to affect his life, it's going to affect Jonathan and all of his descendants going forward. They would have been kings. Not anymore. They're not going to be the kings anymore because of his sin. That's all off the table. And God has chosen a man after his own heart, it says. And a little spoiler there, it's David. I mean, you all know that. But, little spoiler, King David's coming on the horizon. He's not going to be king for a little while, but he's coming up. But let's look further in our text now and see some more developments in this whole military conquest that's happening right now. Let's read from 1 Samuel 13:15. Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying in Geba of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. And the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company toward Ophrah, to the land of Shual, and another company turned toward Beth Horon, and another company turned toward the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. And so the Philistines is, this conquest is advancing, as this military campaign is advancing. They send out 3 companies from this massive army. The ones going north towards Ophrah, well, they're going to the north, so that's one direction they're going. And then those going toward Beth Horon, that's southwest. So they're going north, they're going southwest, and the final one's going east to the valley of Zebulun. So they're just like fanning out. You can see how they're fanning out there. To make matters worse, though, let's read a little more. We're going to see that the Israelites actually don't even have the right implements of war for this whole campaign. Let's read from 1 Samuel 13:19. It says, Now no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. And so Israel is already in this weak position. They're way outnumbered, but they don't even have the right weapons now. They don't have swords to fight against swords of the Philistines. Now, this looks really dire, but this actually is going to set up a great opportunity for God to receive glory, as they're completely outnumbered and they're completely outgunned here. I mean, they are no match for the Philistines here in any way. And you can only imagine this looks like a really bad mistake on Israel's part as a nation, right? That they didn't have any weapons to defend themselves like this. It's hard to believe that they were living like that and thought this was just fine. But that's where they were. But the cool thing about it is, even though they were in this lopsided situation, again, it was going to give God glory, as God really is the one who fought their battles for them all along. So far, though, we've been looking at the faithless in our study today, but now the account takes a turn, and we're going to see those who are filled with faith start to take center stage. And this is where it gets cool. Let's read in chapter 14, verse 1 then. It says, Now the day came that Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young men who was carrying his armor, Come and let's cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people who were with him were about 600 men. And Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp crag on the one side and a sharp crag on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The one crag rose on the north opposite Michmash, and the other on the south opposite Geba. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of those uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. For the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." His armor-bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up. For the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us." When both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, "Behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor-bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will tell you something." And Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel." Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor-bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor-bearer made was about 20 men within about half a furrow and an acre of land. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked so that it became a great trembling. So now this next point we're going to see is really the victory of the faithful. Jonathan and his armor-bearer step out here in really a famous act of faith that we've probably read of before at some point in your Christian life. And as a result of that, they see this tremendous victory. Jonathan seems a little bit dismayed by the lack of action going on here, that we're all just kind of camped out while these raiders have been sent out. And so he decides it's time to step out in faith. The Philistines had sent out raiders from Michmash, but they still had a base there. And notice that in chapter 13, verse 16, it said that Jonathan was back in Geba. And so Geba is like the next city to Michmash. So he's like really close to where the enemy is already. And he decides, let's make this full frontal attack on this camp. Just you and me. He's got one guy with him. It's like, we could take him. It's like, wow, crazy. But he's confident, if the Lord is in it, they will be able to do it. And he's right. And we recognize that even though it looks like a delegation of two, that it's Jonathan and his armor-bearer, we know it's not actually just two, is it? The Lord is with them. We must not miss what he said in verse 6 there, that the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. And so Jonathan recognizes this is God's battle. And so if God's in this thing, not a problem. God can take out these 20 men. And doesn't it seem like oftentimes God works through the underdog like this? This whole battle scene. We've got 600 soldiers on the Israelite side against a countless mass on the other side. And you think about how Israel, weak Israel, the slaves of Egypt, end up conquering Egypt and escaping Egypt, and destroy Pharaoh's army. We think about this battle here. We think about David and Goliath as the classic example. That one transcends, the Christian world. And people talk about that out in the world, about David and Goliath, because it's such a amazing victory of this, scrawny little boy against this seasoned, giant warrior. You think even in the New Testament, we studied the book of John recently as a church, and all those times that Jesus was facing off with the Sanhedrin. I mean, if you'd been standing there, you'd be like, there's this like peasant guy over here, then there's all these guys with all this impressive clothing and credentials and all this, and he's like taking them all down. I mean, verbally, he wasn't fighting them physically, but from a human perspective, it sure looked like it was going to go the other way, but it didn't, did it? Jesus, of course, the Word made flesh, was completely in control. And in 1 Corinthians 1:27, it tells us as much that God likes to use the underdog. In 1 Corinthians 1:27, it says that God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And so maybe as we're studying this today, as I'm reading that today, maybe you feel a little weak. Maybe you feel like the odds are against you. Well, you should get ready for God to show up, is what I would say. Get ready for God to show up in your life. I think about, Calvary Taylor Church. We're a small church here. I mean, today we feel that as in many days, that we're a small fellowship. And yet, as God works in us and is going to work more in the future through us, He's going to receive the glory as a result of that, because we are a small church. We're a weak thing in the eyes of the world. And so Jonathan was impressed by the Lord of how he could know if this exchange was of God or not, if this conquest he was attempting, if this was going to be from the Lord or not. He was impressed by the Lord that if the Philistines tell us to climb up that crag to get to where they are, that means that God is in it and He's going to conquer these people. And so Jonathan tests God's will by that. He tests His will by that. He doesn't just go, well, it's got to be God's will because, we're the Israelites and they're the bad guys. No, he's like, I'm going to put this test out there and see. Maybe it's not God's will for us to take these guys. Maybe He's got some other plan. And I think sometimes we're a little bit hesitant to do that, to give God a test like that of His will that we want to see Him do so we know it's His will. But I think we should do that, honestly, because God often confirms His will in ways that we ask of Him like that, and plans that He puts on our heart. And that really tests our faith, because when we lay a fleece out there, as it were, we're saying basically, I'm not going to go forward unless God does this. And a lot of times when we're putting out a fleece like that, it's something we really want. That's why we're praying about God's will. And it's like, I really want this thing, but I want to know, is this God's will or not? So I'm going to put this thing out there, and I need God to speak to that situation before I can go forward. And that tests our faith, because if it's something that we do really want, we're tempted to compromise and not wait and make sure that it's God's will. We may just say, well, how could it not be God's will? I'm just going to go ahead with it anyways. I mean, that's what our flesh wants to do, but that's why it's so wise for us to give God a chance to speak to that situation, so we know that it's God's will or not, especially if it's a significant decision in our lives. Because even if God ends up giving us a no in that situation, that He doesn't do what we expect Him to do, in fact, we see Him doing the exact opposite of what we thought He would do, getting a no from God is still hearing God's will in our lives. And that's what we want. We want to walk in His will. We want to know what His will is for our lives. That's where the real blessing is. That's where we're going to find those greater things He has for us is within His will. But in this case, God answers Jonathan just the way Jonathan felt impressed by the Lord that he would. He answers exactly as Jonathan asked. And so then Jonathan walks in God's revealed will. Maybe that's the biggest test of faith. It's like, what? You said yes? Okay, now I've got to go forward in this. I was kind of hoping you'd say no, but you said yes. Okay, here we go. We got to follow this now. And so he and his armor bearer take out these 20 soldiers in a little over, like in an acre's land, which isn't that big. We don't talk about acres a whole lot nowadays. Most of us aren't, farmers that are here today. But an acre really isn't that big a land when you think about how big that is. It's a few house lots you might think of in terms of city. And so they take out these men in this relatively small area. I mean, you think about that. I mean, 20 soldiers against 2 guys. The odds of that are not good, right? I mean, these are seasoned soldiers with swords, and only Jonathan has a sword, but they take out 20 of them. But what happens then is much more than this, because as we read on there, it says that God causes an earthquake that brings terror on the Philistines. And the way it describes the Philistines, it says that even the garrison and the raiders trembled. Remember, the raiders, they're not even there. They're like gone. And God brings this earthquake. So all the Philistine military is now freaking out over what God has just done. And this, of course, is going to lead to their defeat, is what's going to happen. Let's read a little more, though. We'll see some. We've already kind of talked about rewards of Jonathan's faith, but we're going to see some more rewards of Jonathan's faith here from 1 Samuel 14:16. It says, "Now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. Saul said to the people who were with him, 'Number now and see who has gone from us.' And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. Then Saul said to Ahijah, 'Bring the ark of God here,' for the ark of God was at that time with the sons of Israel. While Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priest, 'Withdraw your hand.' Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around in the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Bethaven." And so the first reward of Jonathan's faith here we see is that Jonathan really ends up receiving honor for this from Saul and from the people. Seeing the Philistines are, all this commotion going on in the camp, Saul knows something has happened. Something military has happened here that's causing all this stirring in their camp. And so he inquires to figure out who's gone. They number the people, and it turns out that the only ones missing are Jonathan and his armor bearer. And so this numbering made it clear to Saul and everyone else, wow, these two guys left, and look what's going on over there, in this other camp now. And so it's not mentioned here, but it's reasonable to assume that this gave notoriety to Jonathan and his armor bearer. They were recognized now, like, wow, they did something amazing has happened to these guys. And I point that out because sometimes that happens as we step out in faith too. Others take notice of it, and God may, raise our position or something like that as a result of it. Maybe sometimes other people give us praise or something like this. But note that that wasn't what Jonathan was looking for. He wasn't looking for praise from other people. He wasn't looking for them to number him and figure out he was the one over there, anything like that. His heart was just to serve the Lord, is what his heart was in. He was into what God was into. God was into delivering Israel. And so Jonathan was right there. He's following God's will. He's into God's will. And that's what needs to be our heart as well. We need to make sure our heart is just to serve the Lord in our lives and in whatever sphere that is. Because if we begin looking for praise from other people, we just fall into pride and all other kinds of sin. It's not where we want to be. I want to mention here kind of parenthetically that Saul does something odd in the middle of this victory, and he calls for the ark of God, if you probably noticed that. Now, as we studied Saul, we found Saul to be generally unspiritual. He's not really tuned in to the Lord. And so this seems like maybe another outcropping of that. God is clearly moving. Two guys are creating all this chaos. Obviously, God's involved here because these two guys, there's no way they could do that themselves. But Saul's not so sure. So he's like, well, let's get a second opinion here. Let's bring in the priest. And commentators suggest that what he was asking the priest to do was to use the Urim and Thummim stones to try and seek out God's will. And these were these stones they had. We don't know exactly how they worked, but we find them a few times in the Old Testament where they used them to try and discern God's will in a certain point. And that looks like what was happening. But as Saul is having the priest do that, the war that's going on over there in the Philistine camp just like builds. It gets greater and greater, the commotion. And Saul says, wait a minute, I think I see what's going on here. He finally says, withdraw your hand. In other words, you don't need to try and figure that out. I can see now, what's actually going on over here. And we just need to get in on this. We need to follow in after this. The second reward, I would say, that Jonathan, though, receives from his act of faith here is the victory that God gives him, then draws other people into faith also. Notice that from verses 21 and 22, there were a couple sets of Israelite soldiers that now rejoined Saul's army as a result of this. The first one's at verse 21 we hadn't heard about before. We'd heard about those who had hidden themselves and run away, the deserters, but these guys in verse 21 are defectors. They had defected to the other side. They saw this huge army and said, hey, we surrendered. We're on your side now. There they are in the camp of the Philistines. It doesn't mention them being shackled together or anything like that, like prisoners of war. It's just like they said, we're on your team now. And there they are. It's like, wow, traitors, basically. But then also in verse 22, there were those that had deserted Saul previously. They're like, whoa, God is in this thing. Let's get in on this thing. And so it's so cool that is, I call that a reward. Maybe that's not the right term, but for Jonathan to see all these other people, having faith now because of the one act of faith that he and his armor bearer did. And maybe you've had that experience yourself. I know I have, where we see how God is moving in someone else's life, and you feel inspired to believe as a result. You're like, wow, you hear somebody's testimony of what God's done, and you find yourself praising God and thinking, wow, maybe God can handle my situation too. I'm sure he can, after hearing what he did here. And so personally, I like to read biographies or watch historical movies about God's faithfulness in the lives of past missionaries and pastors, certainly people from the Bible and all that, because I find that stirs me up to greater belief in God when I do that. It bolsters my confidence that he's going to work in my life too, and is working in my life. Sometimes we just don't see it. And it motivates me to want to discover and do his will all the more when you read about some of the amazing things that God has done in the lives of other people, not just in the Bible, but even more modern examples. The final reward then of Jonathan's stepping out in faith here is Jonathan gets to be a part of God's bigger plan. Jonathan's act of faith, him and his armor bearer going up and, saying, let's just take these guys on like this, ends up kicking off God's larger plan of victory that day for Israel. Jonathan had no idea that was going to happen. Jonathan just felt led to, let's take these guys on. Let's just, if God leads, let's go. And I am confident God's going to give them to us. And so he had stepped out in faith there. And it was a small step. It was a huge step. I certainly wouldn't want to take on 20 people, militarily. But really, when you compare it to what all God had in mind, it was a very small thing. God then unleashes literally an earthquake as a result of Jonathan's step of faith. And so what a thrill for Jonathan and his armor bearer to be a part of God's plan like that. And this is an opportunity that waits for us every day too as believers. There may be some little thing that we can say or we can do that may result in someone else getting saved or someone else getting delivered from sin in their lives. I always remember a pastor friend of mine, his wife got saved because she found a tract on the street as a little girl. I just found it on the road, and no one was there. No one read it with her, but she read it. It got saved. Some saint dropped a tract. Maybe on purpose, we have no idea. Obviously it was God's purpose. And might I say, some saint had a tract to drop. It's good for us to have tracts as believers so that maybe we get into some conversation and we don't feel like we can explain things well, but this pamphlet does explain, what I'm trying to say to you. But because of this unknown saint, this woman got saved and then became a pastor's wife and ministered to all these people herself as a result. Well, as we compare these two positions we looked at today toward God, that is the faithless view and the faith-filled view, I think it's obvious what camp we want to be in, right? We all want to be full of faith. And so let's pray for more faith from our Father. Faith is a gift from God itself. And let's ask Him for more faith, that we might see great victories in our faith, even from those smallest acts of obedience that we might do. Let's close with prayer. Lord Jesus, we just thank you that you have saved us by your grace, by what you did on the cross for us. But we thank you that, as great as that is, that you bless us further by allowing us to be of use to you in this life while we're still here. And we just pray that we would be of use to you, Lord, that you would work in us, work through us, God, and that the people around us, the world that we live in, would be changed because we were there and we allowed you to work through us. And we'll give you all the glory as you do that. In Jesus' name, amen.